G'day. Welcome to the AgriCoach podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. G'day everyone. Welcome back to the Wealth and Wisdom podcast. My name's Ben Law, I'm the financial bloke, and I'll be your host today. Objectively, the world is more divided than ever. The them versus us narrative pits race against race, native born against immigrants, men against women, old against young, city versus country. The list goes on. Social media, politicians, and the mainstream media have been a significant contributor to this divide. One divide that's dear to my heart is the city-country divide. I grew up on the land. I serve those who still work on it, but I also have mates and family who are full-on city slickers living in the big smoke. A generation ago, everyone in the city had a connection to the bush. A grandfather, an uncle, a cousin, or a mate from boarding school lived on the land. There was a kind of respect for those who did the back-breaking work of farming, feeding both the nation and the world, and often with little reward or complaint. Nowadays, what we often see in the media and from politicians is being dismissive of people from the bush and indifference to the challenges they face. I've seen them unfairly branded as rednecks, bogans, uneducated dummies, or even environmental vandals. And more often than not, they think their opinion just doesn't count. We've seen this play out in politics, where dirty deals are done with political interest groups and the families on the land end up being the ones to wear the negative consequences. The devastating live export saga and land clearing laws in Queensland are prime examples, and the more recent sheep export legislation is all fresh in our minds. The facts are that more people live in the city than the bush, which gives them more political power, and we have to accept that. Now, I'm not alone in thinking that we need to rebuild the well-deserved respect that those who care for our natural resources and feed our families deserve. It's time for Australian agriculture to step up and take control of the narrative. So how do we do that? Well, I don't exactly bloody well know. But the first option is to fight to reclaim the narrative, which I'm seeing more and more these days. Now, I reckon fighting does have a place, but I reckon instead of just fighting and risk fueling the them versus us narrative, we start to bridge the divide and telling our stories. Positive stories that connect those who consume the food we produce with the stories of families from the land, showcasing our love of the land, our animals, and the environment. It would seem to me that influencing rather than fighting is the smarter option. Influence is a superpower, and when people feel persuaded rather than coerced, they're more likely to commit to own the outcomes and be sympathetic to the plight of others. One man leading this charge is Oli from the Humans of Agriculture podcast. He's uniquely situated as he grew up in the city but later fell in love with the bush. Many of his family, mates and peers live in the city, which gives him a unique understanding of their value systems and beliefs, and he's able to then craft stories that showcase how Australian farmers love their animals, love the land, and do so with passion, therefore changing perceptions about people from the bush. Now, Oli tells me that about 20% of his listeners are in the city, so that's a big percentage of his audience that's listening to his stories. He's able to understand the city's misconceptions and pitch the stories to build or rebuild rapport, which is so badly missed. In my opinion, there aren't too many individuals out there like Oli, influencing both people from the city, people from the land, and also politicians who have such a significant impact in our lives. Today, we're going to talk about the positive stories that he's sharing, why it's so important, and how you as individuals can impact the narrative. So without further delay, welcome Oli.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to join you.
Yeah, mate, I've been looking forward to this for a while. It's one of those things. I know you've got a great following on the podcast, and we've got to meet finally down at the Cotton Conference. So I've been eagerly anticipating this discussion.
Well, and I think I probably should start off with an apology because I did bump you back a couple of months ago. And I think, well, and even today, I've probably approached it with a little bit of hesitation, I think, because I second guess it a little bit and go, oh, what value am I going to do? And I always find that I find myself in these situations where, yeah, you kind of want things to be perfect and you don't want to be necessarily having those challenges that kind of are just part of business. So, yeah, it's finally great to sit down with you, and loved seeing you up in Queensland recently too.
Awesome. Thanks, Oli. So, mate, now for most people will obviously in the bush will know who you are with your podcast, Humans of Agriculture. You do a great job, mate. But for those who don't know, you grew up in the city, but you fell in love with the bush at a later state, and you've now arguably got one of the most popular ag podcasts in Australia. How the bloody hell did that happen?
Well, thank you, I guess. No, it's a funny one, and I'd say it's a mixture of by coincidence and kind of planning, and if I can use the word, being strategic as well. But for me, like my connection to farming, I feel like I was this city kid that grew up a lot like the boarders at school and just loved being able to escape to mum's sister's property down here in Western Victoria during the school holidays. And yeah, I grew up like watching the likes of Troy Dan on TV, and I think it's those parts of agriculture which you love, like it's the motorbikes, it's the dogs, it's like, yeah, it's just the excitement of it. And so I fell in love with that side of farming, and it's the pathway which I went down. As soon as I finished school, I couldn't wait to get out and go jackarooing. I didn't go to schoolies or anything. I just wanted to go and start farming, and that's what I did, and did that for the first couple of years. Had a crack starting at Sydney University at one stage, doing ag economics. That didn't quite work out, but yeah, I've always had this love of ag. I've loved the outdoors. To be honest, I never thought I'd be working in an office, and it's kind of a bit bizarre to think it's where I am today, but I just think it's probably a highlight of the opportunities within the industry. Like you can start in one place and yeah, within 10 or 15 years you can go in a whole variety of directions, and I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to experience that.
It's interesting, Oli. It's a story I've heard a lot from people. I've quite often over the years come across young fellas that have grown up in the city and then gone out in the bush and absolutely fell in love with it, and then just got totally passionate about the whole industry and the whole game and the lifestyle. And I quite often come across a lot of ladies, especially in their sort of 50s and 60s, I've seen, that have gone out into the bush teaching, nursing back in the day, and they just got out there, they love the bush, and that's where they've been for the rest of their life and got passionate. And it's quite often the people that come from the city or have a more of a city influence that have gone to the bush and fallen in love with it, that you're usually more vocal about the positive sides of the bush and try and bridge that city-country divide.
Yeah, I think for me, and the benefit of having the podcast is I've met so many different people now who have trodden this pathway. And I know Matt Liniger, who's the CEO of the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation, at a time was CEO of the National Farmers Federation. Like he grew up, I think, on the outskirts of Sydney. John Maher, who went on to lead Rural Co and now sits on plenty of boards. Like he's, again, another, I guess, person who's walked that footpath. So there's so many people that have come from city backgrounds, but I think there's something about agriculture that draws you in, and those people who are fortunate enough to be born into it, it's just part of, I guess, their DNA and their makeup, and the people that discover it at different stages of their life, it just completely encapsulates you. And I think for me, that's what's happened. And yeah, it comes down to, I think, the people and the communities and the experiences that you get through agriculture, that no matter whether you are out in the regions or actually in the city, when you find, I guess, your tribe, it's a pretty special thing. And
it's funny, my offsider, she's a city girl from the UK, and she's been working with farmers now for sort of 8 or 10 years now, and she actually left the industry and went back to England, came back again, and she goes, I just miss working with farmers. She said, they're just so down to earth, easy to deal with. She said, I just want to get back into that game, and it was such a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, what a great story. And I think that's the thing, like I know the unreal thing of being able to employ different people at different stages, whether it's been for longer periods of time or short. But I've loved being able to give people jobs from city backgrounds and letting them experience what there is in ag, and whether it's coming in and doing some short-term kind of marketing and content roles or partnerships or whatnot. People all of a sudden see what is actually involved in ag. And I think it grabs them, and it's something that, yeah, people then want more of.
Now, mate, you've got obviously a lot of city slicker mates, I jokingly say, because I live close to the city where I am these days, and got a lot of mates in the city, a lot of mates in the bush. And I think from memory, and I might get this wrong, that you thought around 20% of your listeners are also from the city, which gives you a really unique position to be in. But what are the major misconceptions that you encounter from those that live in the city, do you think, on a daily basis?
Yeah, and I think I'd say I'm a walking contradiction as well, because I thought I moved back to Geelong a few years ago. I'd done a stint in Sydney with Auctions Plus and thought, okay, that's my time in the city done. And then I'm now living in Melbourne, and I feel like it is a contradiction, but at the same time too, it's kind of just agriculture is all around us. And I was literally only chatting to someone this morning, and I'd say it's one of the challenges I have with Humans of Agriculture is like the default of where we want to land is farming. But agriculture is so much broader than that. And so what I really try and highlight is it's people who are consciously moving or consuming or producing. Like, it's that whole value chain from start to finish, from farm to fork, that actually encapsulates what agriculture is. And now the opportunities and careers within ag are so much broader than, I'll say, just what's on the farm side. And so I actually think when we start to look at where is agriculture around us day to day, its influence is incredibly there, but it's not in the traditional sense, because farming's one part of that puzzle. It's incredibly important. But the people who are working down in Collins Street, just down the road from me, who are working for family offices and in finance, well, actually they're investing back into farmland and into commodities. And yeah, I actually think like that influence of agriculture is all around us. So yeah, when I'm chatting to, and I'll say, yeah, the city slickers, but realistically, that's kind of me. Ag is around us every single day. I think statistically about 50% of jobs in agriculture are actually in capital cities, and I guess that's by nature of what Australia is, with 95% plus of our population in capital cities. So yes, there's the farm side, but actually that whole value chain, if you walk, and I often think of this when I walk down to the South Melbourne markets or Prahran markets or Queen Victoria markets, yes, you have the producers there, but then you've also got the marketers and the traders, and there's probably financial people around you. And then who knows, there might be agribusiness lawyers and others who are influencing you and who are part of the industry all around you as well. And at the end of the day too, there's a whole bunch of passionate consumers that are turning up because they themselves are identifying with something, some sort of value that is why, I guess, they're there to buy that produce.
And do you get any sort of, like, I suppose what I'm trying to get at there, Oli, is, you know, there is this idea of a disconnect between the bush and the city. And I see it in my mates. I see it in people in the city, you know, well-meaning people, good valued people, and there's just this disconnect. And I think for me, what it seems to be, mate, is say 20, 30 years ago, everyone had a deep connection to the bush. You know, they had an auntie, an uncle, a cousin, a grandfather that was on the land or something to do with the land, or they went to boarding school or school with some kids that had come into the city and they were mates with them. There was this real connection. But as the populations have exploded in the cities now and got so great, there is that contradiction there. What are the biggest misconceptions when you start talking to people out there in the marketplace that you see that you go, that's their conception, but this is the way I see the world?
Where to start? I guess the first misconception I kind of want to say, at the end of the day, people who are living in the city and country probably aren't really that different. But I actually think people who are living in rural areas too really have, I guess we can say the city's disconnected from the country, but the country is probably just as disconnected from the city as well, because what matters to the people who are working in this co-working space, to me, might be things like their own finances, their health, their job security. And so the set of challenges that people in country areas is going to be different. But then at the end of the day, what do people want? Well, they probably want a secure job. They want to build their own wealth. They want to be able to afford their own home or property. And what matters to them at the end of the day, they want to feel like they're contributing to something that is beneficial to themselves, to the business, to the broader society. So I think if we start to look like quite holistically, the differences at a really deep emotional level probably aren't that different. But I think the way that people live is, and I think, yeah, people in the city, they are even disconnected just from themselves. Like, I live on a street with probably 100 houses and I know one or two houses on the street. So this fragmentation and disconnection isn't just in isolation. I do think, and it's probably for agriculture and ourselves, and it's that people maybe don't like or respect farming. I'll say that's not true. I think in Australia we're so incredibly fortunate that we've got this system, and as you said, like, we've had this generational change. We've had so many people leave the farming industry over the last couple of decades, but we've actually seen productivity lift. So it's incredible in that sense. Yeah, I think a lot of the misconceptions and things that we kind of create maybe issues from aren't necessary. I think they're fabricated and we're kind of talking to ourselves on them, as opposed to walking out and going, hey, what do you actually want to know? And then let's show you. And so I think that's probably the piece of where I see maybe the uncertainty created in agriculture is when you walk into the supermarket in the city and there's no meat on the shelf and you're thinking, oh shit, has a truck crashed or what's kind of happened? There's no eggs. But then actually when you start to drill down from it or you actually read what it says on the shelf, you kind of go, oh, okay, that makes sense. And to maybe 90% of people, it means absolutely nothing when there's a avian influenza breakout, but to others who want to look a bit further, they can kind of start to dig a little bit deeper.
So how do the discussions go, Oli, when you meet new people down in Melbourne and you're living in Melbourne and they come along and say, what do you do, Oli? And you go, I do a podcast, Humans of Agriculture. And they go, what? How does that conversation go, mate, about telling those stories? Like, how do you pitch that to them? How do you explain what you do?
I'd say probably incredibly poorly. I'll just go, I just have like this little marketing content business, work in agriculture. And then the kind of conversation goes and you start to talk about, well, some of the places I've been over the last few months and the people I've met and people who have built careers or businesses or whatever it might be. As soon as you get that initial kind of into the conversation, like people are actually genuinely fascinated by it. And as you said, that 20% of our audience that are coming back to Humans of Agriculture, it's nearly these people who aspire to live maybe a rural livelihood, but for reasons to themselves, for a professional career or whatever else, they can't live it. But then, when you meet someone down at the footy who has no idea what Humans of Agriculture is and, to be honest, hasn't given ag a second thought, they go, actually, that's fascinating and tell me more about this, whether it's been when we've been on dairy farms and looking at robotic milking or, some of the businesses and people we get to meet. It's actually amazing who we've got. And I think that's the thing. When it comes to the stories of agriculture, it's not necessarily saying, we've got this amazing genetic variety that we've created, blah, blah, blah. It's actually going, have I told you about this person? I met Georgia. She's come from a tech background, worked at realestate.com, started her own business, finished that, but has now found herself managing a mushroom farm just north of Melbourne. And people go, hang on, what? Tell me more about that. And I think that's the thing. The people stories are the ones which really draw people in and create that connection.
Yeah, and that's what I remember a number of years ago when the dairy industry was having, the dairy industry's been having trouble for years around pricing, but I remember there was the whole issue with Woolworths and Coles at the day. And I remember saying to someone, I said, I don't know why, whether it be the dairy industry or whether it be Woolworths and Coles, they start sharing the family stories more and more and more. Because I think once people connect with the people, and it takes me back, I can remember having a conversation with someone many years, maybe 10 years ago, Oli, and they were talking about foreigners. And they were basically saying, bloody foreigners come into the country and, they come from a different culture. And it was a real negative conversation. And I've traveled the world. I lived in London. I've been through Europe, all through Asia and those countries. So I've got to meet a lot of people in a lot of different places. And I remember about 2 years later, they had someone come out and work on their property from a different part of the world, spoke a different language, different cultures, etc. And it was amazing how they changed, like their perception of the world. And it was just that they got to understand the human behind rather than just othering. So they got to understand the human, how they thought. They had the same problems. They had mothers and fathers and children, and they cared for their children. And they wanted better for their children. And it was a really amazing thing to turn around. And that's what I love about what you're doing in agriculture is people start to connect with the people on the land, the families behind the productions. Because I think the danger is the narrative that you see in the media and from politicians quite often doesn't touch on the people. It just touches on the practices. Then they can very much demonize people. And I think once you tell their stories and connect them on that deeper level, you get a much better understanding.
100%. And I'd say it's where we know the news do it so well and the media do it so well in terms of tapping into the emotions of a story. It's the negativity piece which draws you in and makes you feel outraged or makes you feel something that then goes, okay, from that I want to create some sort of reaction. And I think for us, like if we look at and some of the stories that you share, it's going, actually Ben had this career in financial advice beforehand, but actually it's not just this faceless kind of business. It's when people start to say that, they go, cool, well, actually now I can start to see the pieces and the career journey that you've done. And I think it's the same with some of the different families that you've spoken to. And I know you've done quite a few of the 1 and 2 part or even live conversations around succession planning. And I would imagine that the people who are sitting there aren't going, okay, so business A, case study this. They've gone, okay, actually the Lord family went through that and I can identify with the child, or actually I can identify with the parent. And it's that emotional connection that people can start to see, that relatability that then becomes incredibly powerful. And I think that's where podcasts and other mediums are so important, because it's these longer conversations, people start to not necessarily grab the whole pieces, but they'll grab pieces of the story which resonate with them that then ultimately can inspire and enact action as well.
It's interesting. I want to share a little conversation I had with a friend the other day, Oli, around the fire pit. And we're having a few drinks and kids over because I live on the Sunshine Coast. So, there's a lot of people here from the country and the bush, and I work in the ag industry. And a lady who was a professional, 40s, young kids, driven, motivated. And essentially the theme came through that she sort of went, oh, you work with farmers. That's really interesting. She goes, aren't most of them misogynist, environmental vandals that hate women? You know, there was just all the issues that you typically see out of what you'd call an absolute biased individual. Now, I think that's the exception, not the rule. But this person was actually a nice person when you dig down to it. And what I managed to do is I just said, well, look, I don't find that at all. And let me share a few stories. And I did. And I went through a couple of families and talked about dispelled, I suppose, most of those myths and told a few stories of families that I work with. And she was actually shocked. She said, I don't necessarily believe that. She goes, that's not what we see. And it was a real eye-opener for her in the end. She goes, oh, really? And then not that I ever share my podcast with people of the city necessarily, but I said, have a listen to a couple of these episodes and just tell me what you think. And she begrudgingly didn't it. She came back, she goes, you know what? She goes, farmers are a lot smarter than I thought. She goes, I thought they were just, blue-collar workers, I think in her words, uneducated misogynists, which is, as I said, this is the extreme. But she said, you know what? There's really smart business people out there, business women, and there's women coming through that have just as many opportunities as the men in the world. And it was just a complete paradigm shift. And that was just a one-on-one conversation. But I think as an industry, again, if we could do this at scale and we could start having advocates for this, I think we'd change a lot more people's minds. And then when things go to Parliament to get voted on, etc., we're going to have a much better, I suppose you'd say, affinity with those people making the decisions. So, Oli, one of the things that I'm starting to see is more and more people online starting to push back against the political narrative, which is, we've copped a lot of flack as an industry over the last few years with the live export ban for the sheep, for the cattle. There's biosecurity issues. There's a whole lot of problems that we're seeing coming from the political side. Are you talking to many politicians out there, mate, or getting exposure to politicians?
I'll say I see them every now and then. I saw one at the train station this morning. Well, I just want to pick up and then I'll come back to the political thing, because I'd say one of our most listened to areas is actually Canberra, which I'll say is interesting, and potentially maybe we're tapping into that area. And I think it comes down to like the story you were just sharing there around with the lady around the campfire, but it's what are we putting out there? And so I thought when I started Humans of Ag in 2019, I just thought, we've got all these amazing stories. We know that 83% of Australians are disconnected from farming and agriculture. So if we just put more stories out there, then all of a sudden we're going to bridge that connection. What makes our industry so amazing and incredible is actually one of our biggest challenges as well, and I guess that's just human nature. But our humility and, I guess, ability to kind of talk down what we do and not necessarily stand on the rooftops and shout about what's happening and the sophistication and just how advanced some of these businesses and family operations are actually is a key deterrent or detractor to our industry as well, because people are actually unaware. And so we can't expect people to have an understanding of what agriculture is if they have no opportunity to connect into what actually does agriculture look like. And so that's where, for me, it probably took 12 or 18 months where I just thought, I'll just grab a bunch of these different stories and throw them out there and we'll just find the masses. But actually, probably 18 months in, a key kind of moment change where it was like, actually, no, my role is to walk alongside people within the ag industry and ask the questions and champion them in a way that allows them to really champion their own story and showcase it in the best way, because we need to get more stories, more content, more individuals elevated in terms of what they're doing. So people might look at what I'm doing in agriculture and it might have no relevance to them. So then they need to see what you're doing, Ben, or they need to see what Sarah's doing over there. So we actually need a collective and a whole bunch of people to come and be part of these different platforms and be part of the conversation, so we can get a broader audience and a broader group of individuals seeing and identifying and relating to what's happening in ag.
Yeah. Sorry, just before we go into that political side, I totally agree with you, Oli. And just to give you an anecdote of where I came from, I came out of the financial advice industry, as you mentioned before, spent 20 years as a financial advisor, and the industry got destroyed. I think 30% of financial advisors left the industry over the last 5 years. And what happened, what I saw very, very clearly, and I identified it early on, it was a very fragmented industry. So you had a couple of advisor associations representing financial advisors, then you had banks in there, you had insurance companies, you had super funds. And essentially what happened over time is the super funds and the banks had far more political connection than the individual advisors. And what we saw over time, and I won't bore you with a long drawn out story, was essentially the lobbying changed the industry to benefit the super funds and the banks, and then finally the super funds over the banks, and then the whole industry essentially imploded. And the goal was altruistic, to get better quality advice to clients. But what they actually did was they pushed all the good advisors out of the industry and changed it so that only the large companies could deliver advice scaled and profitably enough to be able to do it. And so these unintended consequences. And I see a lot of parallels in the ag industry. You've got some really smart people, but it's so fragmented. So when you're going to say, for example, the politicians, and you've got the Australian Bankers Association, all the banks go together. You've got the ag industry, and you've got the Dairy Association, you've got the beef, you've got Cattle Australia. You've got such a fragmented industry that you completely water down your political power.
Yeah, no, and I think it's the perfect conduit into the political thing. Have I spoken with many of them? I'd say at times, but no, to be honest, not hugely. And I actually find them quite interesting, like in terms of how their career pathways have led them to where they are. But I remember, and I can't remember who it was, but I was talking to some, whether it was maybe it was a state-based ag minister, and they said they probably spend the first 5 minutes of every meeting with an ag organisation actually just trying to get up to speed on who this person is, what organisation are they from, what commodities are they representing. And so exactly as you're saying, the politicians, like I've never seen a schedule like what is on some of their calendars to have these 20-minute blocks for 12 hours a day. Like the amount of information they're getting, I think, as you say, how do we make it as easy for them and go in with that clear ask? And I think an example, and I've been fortunate to know Nikki Ford, who's recently finished up at Australian Organic Limited, but I think my understanding of where she really excelled was she went in with her top couple of asks, and it was just consistent and was like, hey, this is what we need for the organic industry. We've consulted all our members and this is what we're looking for. But I think in agriculture, we can't even work out if we call our individual commodity groups, do we call them industries or sectors, or what are they? And I think it's a challenging job in advocacy because, as you say, I think we've got more than 280 odd different advocacy bodies in agriculture. So for one politician at a national level or one at a state level, it's incredibly hard for them to get across. And so I think for us, we actually need to look at ourselves as an industry and go, how do we make their lives easier to ultimately benefit ourselves, our communities, our businesses in the conversations that actually matter, because time is a limited thing. And
have you had any conversations with them about their perception of the industry and what you're doing, et cetera, trying to raise that, or haven't been able to get close enough to do that?
To be honest, I probably haven't. I know of different groups and whatnot that have got really close to ministers to be able to get grant funding and stuff. And for me, I really wanted to be able to build a commercial business. And so I wanted to probably do it in a world separate from the politics side of things, because I think you then got to form allegiances and take one side over the other. For me, I think, and it's probably something we talked about last time, but I think there's a huge opportunity for the ag industry to build the better relationships with the community and consumers, because ultimately that is where the influence is going to happen. So yes, you need these different organisations meeting with politicians, but on the flip side, what are we doing at the community level to really build that understanding, to build that engagement, to build that sense of community and conversation? Because if you do that, you're actually going to influence the votes the other way anyway. And that's ultimately what politicians are interested in for themselves.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Oli, I had a conversation with someone, I'm not going to name drop, but someone that's pretty influential and well-known in the ag space. And he's a farmer, and he was having a conversation with a couple of mates, and, they're in their 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, he said, and they were all belly aching about what was going on in the ag industry, politically and with markets and the EU and all the troubles that are coming over there. And he said to them, well, what are you encouraging your kids to do? And they said, what do you mean? He said, well, are you encouraging them to start to get involved in industry associations, get involved in politics, looking at serving the community? And every single one of them says, oh, God, no. Who'd want to be involved in that? And he said, I highlighted very easily to them the fact that, as an industry, 20, 30, 40 years ago, people would come up and want to serve the industry, which I think is what you're doing, mate, is they wanted to serve the industry. They wanted to do their time. They wanted to be able to have some influence in the world. Nowadays, it's got so murky a lot of the time that most people go, gosh, I don't want to stick my fingers in that snake pit. But we're going to have to get to the point where everyone's going to have to be responsible for the narrative and the conversation and promoting the industry. Otherwise, it's never going to change. And we'll end up being like the financial advisors got to the point where they had no political power. The big industries managed to change the world and they were left wanting.
Yeah, and I think I often chat to my mates about this, and it's going, okay, you don't have to be the spokesperson or the figurehead or anything, but whether it's paying your levies or just being involved and making sure that you're staying up to date with what's actually happening. Ultimately, in leadership, followership is such an important part of it. And so I think for us as an industry and as these different groups is going, all right, who do you actually resonate with? Who's representing your interests? And how can you be involved? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, your business is going to be directly impacted by it. So you want to be across what are those risks that are happening in 5, 10, 15, potentially 20 years.
And people are so busy these days, aren't they? Like, I mean, you look at you, the podcast is part of what you do, but you've got your commercial side of the business, which we'll talk about in a little while. But you're so busy trying to make a buck, trying to run things, manage staff, marketing, all those things. It's very hard to then find time to think about anything else, isn't there? And I think everyone, city and country, are finding the exact same thing.
Yeah, I think everyone's busy, isn't it? It's insane. I think it's also coming back to what are you interested in? And so I think, like for me personally, I think of it from like an investment lens. Well, like the share markets and stuff don't really interest me, but I know that there's benefit in being in them. So how do I find the person who can represent my interests in that? And so I think it's the exact same thing in advocacy or any sort of, invested interests that you have. You've got to somehow align if it's going to potentially impact you. And when there's upside and benefit, you're kind of mad not to be in the arena there.
So how important do you think it is? Like if we actually break this down to tin tacks, how valuable is telling good quality stories to not only the politicians, people in the city, bureaucrats? Is it as important as I think it is, Oli?
I'd say it's everything really. Like I'd say it's one of the key human needs. It's what connects us to people. Like if we were to sit here and just talk without sharing stories, like I think the whole conversation we've bounced off each other with different stories of things that have happened in various aspects of our lives. But I think if you look at it through more of a commercial lens and go, okay, well, what role does storytelling have? I'd say it's everything from how do you actually promote your business and promote your business from, okay, we need to find some employees. So I actually need to be able to tell a story about what we do, why we do it, and why someone else would even be remotely interested in coming and being part of it. If I'm looking for a new livestock agent, well, actually I need to be able to share a story with them about, again, what we're doing and what's in it for them. And then I think, as we start to step through, it's not trying to take the same story and tell it the exact same way to those different people. They're all different target markets with different outcomes that you want from each of them. So whether it's an employee or a potential investor or a potential customer or a politician, you need to be able to share that story in a different way that's going to resonate with them. But ultimately, knowing what's in it for me. So why is it important to have this conversation with you today, Ben? What's in it for your audience? And at the end of the day, why is that important to me and why does that matter? And that's where the stories are so vitally important, because stories are just a whole bunch of pieces of what have been our lives so far and what matters to us. And I think it's an incredibly powerful thing. And that's kind of just why I love it.
And I think you can change a paradigm. Like I look at that lady I mentioned before around the fire pit, having that conversation, is her whole world changed around all of a sudden, her perception of the world going forward. And I think if the more stories you tell, especially the more personal stories, the more chance that will get in front of a politician one day or a bureaucrat that's deciding to sign a piece of paper or put some legislation in place and feel some empathy rather than indifference, I think can only be a good thing. And it reminds me back to when my dad, I think it was 30 years ago, we had a fair bit of irrigation on our property, and one day a bureaucrat came and turned around and took 80% of their water allocation off them and went from being a viable farming block to now all of a sudden just essentially a hobby farm, that block. And I can remember Dad having the conversation with people in the Water Resources Council back then, and they're just saying, oh, well, someone's just drawn a line on a map. They have no connection with you. Whereas once they have the connection with the people on the land, it adds a whole lot of value. And I think if every one of us that are connected to the ag industry influenced 10 people, and if let's say there's 500,000 people, that's 5 million people we can influence very, very quickly. And I think if everyone does that, then we're going to get this magnifying effect over time, which will then positively influence things. And quite often the narrative is like the Titanic. It takes a long time to shift, but if we all get involved and all tell those positive stories, then yeah, the world's our oyster, isn't it?
It is, and I love that because I think like 10 people is easy to do, and you go, okay, I'm going to do that in the next 12 months. I'm going to find one person a month, and I just want to try and find someone who's in a different area to me and have a conversation with them. And naturally, I actually think people would be having maybe more than that every year, but it's going, actually, how do you do it with intent? And you've actually made me laugh a little bit at myself, because when I started Humans of Agriculture, I thought, oh, well, if we can share 10,000 stories of different people in ag, well, then we'll be able to change the narrative and dialogue and shift kind of the stigma of what's involved in ag. And we actually dialed it back and go, all right, off every interview, how do we just influence 10 people or make them more aware, or how do we connect them to this different person or this different industry? Then that's kind of a far more tangible thing and something we can measure. So I reckon you're onto something there.
Well, it's all compound interest, isn't it? You compound it over time, everyone gives it a good go and get everyone motivated and get everyone on the same path. So, Oli, that's been good. Mate, podcast is part of what you do. You also do some other stuff. And like me, the podcast is only part of what I do. My coaching business is where I feed the family and have my impact elsewhere. What's the other component of your business, mate?
Yeah, it's taken probably a little while to work out. And I guess the podcast is what we're known for. And it's the part I think it's, in a way, being known for something is incredible, but then it can also be a bit of a hamstring. So our big piece is obviously using storytelling. How do we support businesses and the ag industry more broadly to showcase what they do? So part of what we do is through Humans of Agriculture, obviously with the podcasts and videos, but then also really helping businesses in the way that they share stories. And that comes down to promoting pieces around, the business itself, employment opportunities, what they're actually up to, their role in the community, and being able to, create more of those intangible connections to people. So I guess the best example is what we do with the grains industry. So the grains industry, GRDC, Research Development Corporation, they do incredible work. They invest upwards, I think, of like $200 million a year on behalf of the grain sector into various areas. They are incredibly research heavy, and our role is to go, all right, well, how do we grab these different growers, advisors, researchers, and share the human story to them? And ultimately, at the end of the day, that creates a stronger connection between the research outcomes of what these people are achieving, but also why have they chosen to do it in the grain sector and why are they so passionate about it and how have they actually got there. And for us, it's kind of staying right on track and on tune in terms of what we want to do, but it benefits that business incredibly as well because it's just an extra layer to build that connection with their audience as well.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely needed, Oli. And I'm going to make you a little bit uncomfortable here, mate, so get prepared. This is something I said to you when we first met. But the reason I started the podcast was because I want to influence, like you, 10,000 families. That's where I want to get to. And I'll do that over time. And mine's a bit of a slower burn, but that's what I want to do is change the lives of so many families and help them avoid the 3-generation curse. And the only way to do that is to have influence. And that's why the podcast, I get to meet cool people like you. I get to learn. I get to take the knowledge from the people that got it to the people that want it. And therefore, once you've got a profile, you can then influence the industry. And I actually look at Oprah Winfrey as a prime example. Love her or hate her. She came from nowhere. She's now arguably one of the most influential people in the world or has been over her time. And now she can change politics. She can have influences on companies. It's just amazing just because of her profile. And I think you're in a really bloody good position, Oli, with what you're doing. I love what you're doing. I think you share a real positive story rather than, a lot of the negativity we see in the media. And I think you've got a unique position to be able to share those stories and influence our industry at scale. So I just want to put the fire under you, mate, and push you forward. I actually think any industry associations that are listening, if you want to tell good stories, if you want to share it, get in contact with Oli. And mate, I reckon if you can keep building on what you're doing, there's the potential for you to change not only the narrative we've got out in there in the industry, but I also think politically there's a way for you to influence that over time. So, mate, big challenge.
Oh, geez. I guess, just thank you so much, Ben. I think for me, it's people obviously talk a lot about imposter syndrome and that self-belief, but I think, it's so important to have other people around you being able to see kind of what's possible and being able to feed that in as well. So, no, I absolutely love obviously what you do and thank you because for me, it's not about me trying to do something for myself. I really want to do this for my mates. I want to do it for other people who are like me at 15, 16 years old who are at school in Sydney or Melbourne or wherever it is who have no idea of what the opportunities are in agriculture and how do I play a role in helping showcase people while I'm somewhat relatable to them. And so I feel like in a way I'm running out of time a little bit to be able to connect back in with school kids. But a key part of that is then being able to support and, as Richard Raines always says, put the wind under the next generation coming through, because it's so vitally important for our sector to be relevant and in front of people, because really the world relies on agriculture, and the opportunities for us as a sector is huge if we can roll our sleeves up and really own the opportunity we've got in front of us.
Appreciate that, mate. Now, Oli, two things I just want to ask you before we head off today is, number one, where can people find more about you online for the podcast if they haven't already come across it?
Yeah, so on Instagram, we're just at Humans of Agriculture with an underscore, but the best place to find us is humansofagriculture.com. And if you want to chat to me directly, hit the contact us button there. I'll reply to you directly. So, would love to chat with anyone and all your listeners, Ben.
Perfect, mate. Now, Oli, how old are you, mate?
I'm 32 and I know what's coming.
Yeah, I know. I always say 10 years ago. See, the problem is I love helping the next generation. I'm really passionate. The families that I work with, I love nothing more than seeing the next generation starting to thrive. But like you mentioned, I'm now 47. So I'm right on that cusp now of I used to be fun Uncle Benny to my nieces and nephews, but I'm starting to get a little bit too much grey hair. But what we want to do, mate, is always look back and look at what we do if we had some time again. So if you went back in a time machine, say 10 to 12 years ago, mate, say in your early 20s, what bit of advice would you give yourself?
Yeah, and I knew this was coming, so I've thought about it a lot, and I probably do think about this stuff a lot. And I'd say the advice I'd give to myself 10, 15 years ago is just as relevant as what I'd say today. And it's have greater confidence in yourself, back yourself more, and really kind of get out of your own way, because there's so many people around you that really want to see you succeed. There's more people who want to see you succeed than not. And there's so many people who will give you a hand to succeed. So, have a crack, back yourself, and at the end of the day, you're always employable if you work for someone.
Do you know the really funny part, Oli, is that back yourself is my number one piece of advice to myself. I'd go back in the day because I still have imposter syndrome today. I mean, we all probably suffer from it some way, shape or form, but you'd be shocked how many people the theme is back yourself, take the risks, have a crack, because the risks aren't as great as you think they are. And it's funny when I get to ask people that are in their 20s, I ask them in their 30s, I ask them in their 40s, ask them in their 50s, and I can guarantee you, mate, when you're 42, if someone asked you that same question, you'd still have the same piece of advice for yourself. Yeah,
no, totally. I'd say that probably the top three values that I try and live by is it's definitely back yourself and see what's possible. Find the moments for childlike fun. Like, don't take yourself too seriously, and then live with curiosity. And I think that's in any sort of, looking at what's possible or in conflict or anything. If you lead with curiosity and with a genuine curious mind, then you're going to come at things from a really good place.
And that's why you're so good at the interviewing, mate, is because you come with absolute curiosity. Every time I listen to your podcast, I almost hear the gears grinding in your head, being curious, like just one thing after the other. It's one thing that I really struggle with sometimes. I make statements rather than questions. And that's the one thing I love about you, mate, is you are, in everything you do, is you come across as curious. And I think that's a superpower. It's what I try and teach my 8-year-old.
Oh, you're a legend. Thanks so much, Ben.
Awesome. All right, mate. Well, we're done for today. Anyone, I'll put in the show notes, but you can just literally get on the internet, Google Humans of Agriculture. Love what you do, Oli. And, mate, we'll probably do another one of these one day.
Yeah, I'll get you on ours. Cheers, mate.
Well, I was really grateful for Oli coming on the podcast. He's a very busy man, and it's great to hear from someone who's as enthusiastic about the ag industry as I am. Now, the number one takeaway I just want to give you before I go away, I always write a lot of notes, and the number one I wrote today was curiosity. I think curiosity is an absolute superpower. It's what I'm trying to teach my 8-year-old, is to become more curious. I think in family situations, if you can be more curious about what people are saying or feeling or seeing, I think you're going to have a lot less conflict. I think in business, if you're going to be curious about your employees, about your suppliers, your customers, etc., you're going to do far more. You're going to make more profit. And I think when we're dealing with people outside of the ag industry that have different opinions to us, especially politicians, is to become more curious and understand why they think what they do. It's something I struggle with. I think it's a superpower that I'm trying to learn and foster. And I think if you put in enough time, effort, and energy, and you can actually achieve a high level of curiosity. And as I said, Oli has it, bucket loads of it. in himself. So that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you share it with your family and friends. That's the best thank you we can get. And also to jump on the socials, jump on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a 5-star rating. That helps us find more people. So that's it for today. I'll see you with the next episode.